I am here in the heart of Snowdonia. This is the Road DM exploring mountains. So usually the mountains are the second thing drawn on a map after the coastline, but you can't just plonk a mountain wherever you want. You've got to think about how it coordinates with the shape of the rock and the coastline. And of course, mountains are originally formed by plate tectonics crashing into each other or grinding alongside each other. Mountains most definitely have a mysteriousness about them. In fact, in some stories, such as The Hobbit, the mountain can even be its own living entity. Think about the storm titans that fought each other. There's also the idea of the mountain being its own living entity, almost like a presence that affects the things around it. Maybe it affects the soil in a good way or a bad way, depending on whether the people who live within its presence do good or ill. There is also the representation of trolls being like the very rocks they came out of. And the mountain range could even be a small part of something big. Maybe a leg or a foot of a sleeping god. Okay, so you might get communities that worship the mountain or revere it almost like a god. But what about those who use it for other purposes? Remember that mountains are wonderful places for defense. They are huge, they are very strong, they are very sturdy, and of course you can build all over them. You can also build in vantageous points, so you can look down your enemy, pour hot oil on them, or they have trouble climbing up to get to you. Of course, the main pivotal thing about mountains is the rivers that carve their way through the rock. The thing is, of course, they provide for people closer to the summit, but if you think about how far a river travels, it can also completely provide for people way down by the coast. Roads and rivers tend to run along the valley. This would make a much better trade route than, say, going towards the top or even on the very summit of the mountain, for many reasons. For one thing, the weather gets worse the higher up you go due to lack of shelter, but also weather systems can get trapped against the side of a mountain, so anything from rain or snow or worse can be something that you could throw on your poor unsuspecting adventurers. There are, of course, more environmental hazards too, like landslides, or if you're in a more snowy type terrain, avalanches. So of course, in terms of terrain and navigating a mountain, it's going to be a lot more difficult than your average clump of hills. But mountains are great for putting in so many other aspects environmentally. For example, behind me is this beautiful lake. It could be a water source, it could be a food source, it could be where something nasty lives too. To adventurers, though, going up the mountain is usually more appealing. This is due to several reasons, one of them being that, of course, it's off the beaten track, which means that it has been explored less. There will be more things for them to find. There are also very beautiful views. For example, you can even look down on clouds, which you don't really get anywhere else. The only problem, though, is when it comes to methods of transport, horses become rather impractical. Altitude most definitely determines the temperature, and also how much oxygen is in the air. Remember that the higher up you go, the harder it is to breathe because the atmosphere is a little thinner, especially if you're going up a very, very high mountain indeed. But even though mountains feel colder the higher up you go, because of the thinning oxygen, it can also be hotter if there are not many clouds in the sky. This can cause sunburn, or possibly worse. So if your adventurers want to play it safe, then the best thing for them to do would be to follow the rivers. There are bound to be crossing points on them too that have been laid down by people before them. Although, if there aren't any bridges or conveniently placed stepping stones, they'll obviously have to do a bit of work themselves. There are, of course, shallower points of rivers that are easy to wade through. However, when it comes to drinking water, it's the faster flowing water that you want to obtain rather than the water that's been stagnant for ages. Of course, everyone knows about the desolation of Smaug and the Lonely Mountain, but there are a lot more things that dwell within mountains besides dragons. In terms of animals, you have various birds, including birds of prey, wolves, mountain lions. You sometimes even have things like badgers. And then, when it comes to your other races, think about things like mountain elves, remote and hated races in more populous areas such as ogres too.
So quite often, mountains are a home of tranquility and peace and quiet, which means that quite a lot of very small religious communities can live there. This can be, of course, in terms of monasteries, but don't forget as well about the standing circles. Of course, monasteries are very beautiful pieces of architecture, but standing stones are a true test of time. And even if they're abandoned, they can still be upright and erect and hold this mysteriousness. So, for example, if the adventurers just came across it and there was nobody there, why is it there? Does it have some kind of magic underlying, or has it just been completely left because of some threat in the area? Or is it because the souls of the place have been locked away underneath a giant stone where sacrifices reigned?
You are bound to find livestock such as goats and sheep, since they can navigate through the mountains so well. They would certainly make a good food source. But then when it comes to plant life, you will not find much up here at all. Yes, they're close to the sun, but there's not much fertility in terms of the soil. Probably not much water either, since it just tends to run into the rivers. And as for the lack of shelter, well, if you've ever seen a stunted tree before, you know exactly what I mean.
So in conclusion, if you want to make more out of those little pointy things on a map, then maybe think about the communities as well as the environment. Think about what was there before the adventurers actually went up there and discovered it. This has been the Rogue DM exploring mountains.